settle into bed, let your thoughts slow down. Breathe in gently and let the quiet echoes of the past carry you into rest. Tonight, we journey into the heart of an ancient Islamic empire that shaped 3 continents. A realm of crescent moons and home, call to prayer, of golden domes rising against twilight skies. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire, from the mighty gates of Constantinople to the windswept deserts of Arabia, from legendary sultans to scholars, poets, and forgotten queens, and from its powerful rise to the soft silence of its fall. You will hear the tale of Mehmed the Conqueror and the dream of a city reborn. You will witness the grandeur of Suleiman the Magnificent, whose empire stretched as far as the eye could see, and you will drift gently through shadowed palaces, hidden gardens, and the fading whispers of a world where East met West. Let this peaceful story guide you to sleep as you fall asleep to history, carried by the timeless rhythm of a forgotten empire. Welcome to Mystic Bedtime Stories. Tonight, we remember the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. In the gentle mists of 13th century Anatolia, where the ancient world was slowly giving way to something entirely new, there lived a young man whose name would echo through the corridors of time for 7 centuries. His name was Osman, and though he could not have known it then, he carried within him the seeds of an empire that would span 3 continents and touch the lives of millions. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of northwestern Anatolia, where the grass grows, tall and golden in the autumn light. Here, among the scattered remnants of the great Seljuk Empire, small tribes of Turkmen nomads moved like shadows across the landscape. They were warriors and shepherds, poets and dreamers, carrying their entire world on horseback as they had done for countless generations. Osman was born around 1258 into one of these tribes, led by his father, Ertugrul Bey. The tribe was neither the largest nor the most powerful, but they possessed something perhaps more valuable than gold or fertile land. They had vision, and they had faith. They were Muslims who had traveled far from the steppes of Central Asia, bringing with them not just their flocks and their weapons, but also their dreams of a promised land where they might build something lasting. The young Osman grew up listening to the stories told around evening fires, tales of great conquests and noble warriors, of the Prophet Muhammad and the early caliphs who had spread Islam across vast territories. But more than the stories of the past, it was the whispers of the future that seemed to captivate him. The elders spoke of signs and portents, of a destiny that awaited those who were bold enough to seize it. When Osman was still a young man, barely past his 20th year, his father Ertugrul passed away, leaving him to lead their small band of perhaps 400 tents. It was a modest inheritance by any measure, but Osman possessed something that would prove far more valuable than vast herds or great treasures. He had the rare gift of inspiring others to believe in possibilities they had never dared to imagine. It was during these early years of his leadership that Osman experienced the dream that would become the foundation myth of the Ottoman Empire. The story, as it has been passed down through generations of storytellers, tells us that Osman was staying as a guest in the home of a respected sheikh named Edebali. This wise man had a daughter of remarkable beauty and intelligence, and young. Osman found himself deeply drawn to her. One night, as Osman slept in the sheikh's house, he was visited by a vision so vivid and powerful that it would shape the course of his entire life. In this dream, he saw the moon itself descend from the heavens and enter his chest, filling him with a light so brilliant that it seemed to illuminate the entire world. From his body grew a magnificent tree, its branches reaching out to embrace the furthest corners of the earth. The tree's roots delved deep into the earth beneath 3 great cities: Constantinople, a jewel of the Byzantine Empire; Baghdad, the ancient seat of the caliphs; and Mecca, the holy city of Islam. Its branches stretched out to touch the peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, the waters of the Danube River, the shores of the Euphrates, and even the distant Nile. Beneath this great tree, Osman saw rivers flowing like silver threads, and from every branch hung the crescents and stars that would one day become the symbol of Ottoman power. But the most remarkable part of the vision was yet to come. As Osman gazed upon this tree of destiny, he saw that from its leaves emerged countless warriors on horseback, their banners flying in winds that carried the scent of victory. They rode toward the four corners of the earth, and wherever they went, they brought not destruction, but order. Not chaos, but justice. Not darkness, but the light of faith. When Osman awoke from this dream, he was trembling with the power of what he had seen. He immediately sought out Sheikh Edebali and related every detail of the vision. The old man listened in silence, his eyes growing wide with wonder and recognition. When Osman finished his account, the sheikh nodded slowly and spoke words that would ring in the young leader's ears for the rest of his life. "My son," the sheikh said, his voice soft but filled with conviction, "this dream is a sign from the Almighty. The moon that entered your chest is the light of faith, and the tree that grew from your body is the empire that will grow from your descendants. Allah has chosen you to be the founder of a dynasty that will rule over vast lands and countless peoples. You will build a state that will endure for centuries, bringing justice to the oppressed and spreading the light of Islam to lands that have never known its peace." The sheikh paused, studying Osman's face in the flickering light of the oil lamp. "And as a sign of my faith in this destiny, I give you my daughter's hand in marriage. Her name is Malhan, and she will be the mother of the future sultans who will sit upon thrones in cities that do not yet know their names." This marriage between Osman and Malhan was more than a union of two young people. It was a symbolic joining of the warrior and the mystic, the practical and the spiritual, the earthly ambition and the divine vision. From this union would spring the Ottoman dynasty, a line of rulers who would combine the fierce independence of the nomadic warrior with the sophisticated wisdom of Islamic civilization. But dreams, no matter how powerful, must be given form through action. Osman understood that the tree of his vision would not grow by itself. It would need to be planted in the soil of reality, watered with sweat and tears, and tended with the careful attention of a skilled gardener. He began to gather around him men who shared his vision, warriors who were willing to follow him not just for the promise of plunder, but for the chance to build something greater than themselves. In those early years, Osman's band operated much like the other Turkmen tribes of the region. They were Ghazis, holy warriors who fought on the frontier between the Islamic world and the Christian Byzantine Empire. But unlike many of their contemporaries, who were content to raid and retreat, Osman had a different strategy. He sought not just to defeat his enemies, but to win them over, to offer them a place in the new order he was building. This approach would become one of the defining characteristics of Ottoman success. Rather than simply destroying what they conquered, the Ottomans developed a genius for absorption and transformation. They took the best elements of the civilizations they encountered and wove them into their own expanding tapestry. Byzantine administrators found themselves serving Ottoman sultans. Christian soldiers discovered that they could rise to positions of great power in the Ottoman military. Scholars and artisans from all faiths contributed to the growing sophistication of Ottoman culture. As Osman's reputation grew, so did his following. Young men from across Anatolia came to serve under his banner, drawn by stories of his justice, his generosity, and his seemingly supernatural ability to emerge victorious from even the most difficult battles. They called him Osman Ghazi, Osman the warrior, and they spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and awe that bordered on reverence. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Osman was not his skill as a warrior, or his talent as a leader, but his ability to see beyond the immediate horizon. While other tribal chiefs fought for control of this valley or that fortress, Osman was already envisioning a state that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Red Sea. He understood that true power came not from the ability to destroy, but from the capacity to create, to build institutions that would outlast any individual ruler in the quiet moments between battles. When the camp was settled and the horses were grazing peacefully in the moonlight, Osman would often be found in deep conversation with his closest advisors, planning not just the next campaign, but the next century. He spoke of laws that would govern justly, of markets that would bring prosperity, of schools that would spread learning, of bridges that would connect distant lands. His followers listened with growing excitement, beginning to understand that they were not just joining a raiding party, but participating in the birth of something unprecedented in human history. The tree of Osman's dream was beginning to take root, sending out its first tentative shoots into the fertile soil of possibility. In the years to come, those shoots would grow into mighty branches, and the shade of the Ottoman tree would shelter peoples and nations across 3 continents. But for now, in these early days of the 14th century, it was enough that the seed had been planted, and that somewhere in the hills of Anatolia, a young man named Osman was beginning to transform the world, one careful step at a time. Moon that had entered his chest in that fateful dream continued to shine within him, guiding his steps as he moved toward a destiny that would make his name immortal, and his vision a reality that would endure for over 600 years. The years following Osman's prophetic dream unfolded like the pages of an ancient manuscript, each one revealing new chapters in the story of a people destined for greatness. As the 14th century dawned over the hills of Anatolia, the small band of Turkish warriors who had once huddled around campfires, sharing dreams and stories, began to transform those dreams into reality with a patience and determination that would become legendary. Osman's son, Orhan, inherited not just his father's throne, but also his vision. Where Osman had planted the seed, Orhan would nurture the sapling, watching it grow strong and tall under his careful guidance. Born in 1281, Orhan possessed his father's strategic mind, but tempered it with a diplomat's understanding of when to fight and when to negotiate, when to advance and when to consolidate. The world that young Orhan inherited was one of extraordinary complexity and opportunity. The great Byzantine Empire, which had once commanded the respect and fear of the entire Mediterranean world, was now like an ancient oak tree whose mighty trunk was beginning to hollow out from within. Internal strife, economic decline, and the constant pressure of various enemies had left the empire, vulnerable in ways that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. Yet the Byzantines were far from helpless. Their capital, Constantinople, remained one of the greatest cities in the world, its massive walls and strategic position making it seem virtually impregnable. The empire still controlled important trade routes, and its diplomatic networks reached across Europe and into Asia. Most importantly, it retained the loyalty of many of its subjects, who saw in the imperial purple banners not just political authority, but the continuation of a Christian civilization that had endured for over 1,000 years. Into this delicate balance of power, Orhan moved with the careful precision of a master chess player. He understood that the key to Ottoman expansion lay not in grand, dramatic gestures, but in the accumulation of small advantages, the patient building of alliances, and the gradual erosion of his enemy's will to resist. One of Orhan's first major successes came in 1326, when he captured the city of Bursa after a siege that lasted several years. This victory was significant not just for its military importance, but for what it revealed about the evolving nature of Ottoman warfare. Rather than simply storming the city walls and putting the population to the sword, As many conquerors of the time would have done, Orhan chose a different path. He offered generous terms to the city's defenders, guaranteeing the safety of those who surrendered and promising to respect the religious practices of the Christian population. Many of the Byzantine officials who had governed the city were invited to remain in their positions, now serving the Ottoman state. This policy of inclusion and tolerance, which would become a hallmark of Ottoman rule, was not born merely from humanitarian considerations, though Orhan was known to be a man of genuine compassion. Rather, it reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to build a stable, lasting empire. By treating conquered populations with respect and offering them a stake in the new order, the Ottomans were able to transform potential enemies into allies. Christian merchants found that they could trade more freely under Ottoman rule than they had under the increasingly restrictive Byzantine system. Farmers discovered that Ottoman tax collectors were often more reasonable than their Byzantine predecessors. Artisans and scholars found that their skills were valued and rewarded regardless of their religious background. This approach to conquest and governance was revolutionary in its time. Most medieval empires were built on the principle of domination, with the ruling class extracting wealth and labor from subjugated populations while giving little in return. The Ottomans, by contrast, developed what might be called a philosophy of incorporation. They sought to make their subjects partners in the imperial enterprise rather than simply victims of it. The capture of Bursa also marked another important milestone in Ottoman development. It gave them their first real capital city. No longer would the Ottoman leadership govern from horseback or from temporary encampments. Bursa became the center of an increasingly sophisticated administrative system, with permanent officials, established courts, and regular procedures for everything from tax collection to military recruitment. Orhan established his court in Bursa, with all the ceremony and dignity befitting a sovereign ruler. He minted his own coins, bearing his name and titles in both Arabic and Turkish. He commissioned the construction of mosques, schools, and public baths, transforming the city into a center of Islamic learning and culture. Most importantly, he began to attract scholars, merchants, and craftsmen from across the Islamic world, all drawn by the promise of opportunity and the reputation for just governance that was already beginning to attach itself to the Ottoman name. But perhaps the most significant development during Orhan's reign was the creation of the Ottoman military system that would prove so devastatingly effective in the centuries to come. The early Ottoman army was built around the concept of the Ghazi, the holy warrior fighting for the expansion of Islamic territory. These men were motivated not just by the prospect of plunder, though that was certainly a factor, but by a genuine religious conviction that they were doing God's work. The Ottoman cavalry, in particular, became legendary for its speed, mobility, and tactical sophistication. These were not the heavily armored knights of Western Europe, who relied on the massive shock of a coordinated charge. Instead, the Ottoman horsemen were masters of the hit-and-run attack, the feigned retreat, and the carefully orchestrated ambush. They could strike like lightning and disappear like smoke, leaving their enemies confused and demoralized. But the Ottomans were not merely raiders. They also developed a remarkable talent for siege warfare, learning from the best engineers and artisans they encountered. They studied the latest developments in military technology, adapting and improving upon innovations from across the known world. When gunpowder weapons began to appear in Europe, the Ottomans were among the first to recognize their potential and to invest heavily in their development. Under Orhan's leadership, the Ottoman state also began to develop its distinctive approach to religious and cultural diversity. While the empire was explicitly Islamic in its identity and laws, it made room for Christians and Jews to practice their faiths and participate in economic and intellectual life. This policy, known as the millet system, would eventually become one of the most sophisticated approaches to managing religious diversity in the pre-modern world. A millet system was based on the Islamic legal principle that people of the book, Christians and Jews, were to be protected and allowed to govern their own communities according to their own laws, as long as they acknowledged the political authority of the Islamic State and paid the appropriate taxes. Under the Ottomans, this principle was developed into a comprehensive system of autonomous religious communities, each with its own leadership, courts, and educational institutions. This approach to diversity was not merely a matter of tolerance. It was a strategic asset. By allowing different communities to maintain their own identities while participating in the broader imperial framework, the Ottomans were able to tap into a much wider range of human talent and resources than would have been possible under a more rigid system of religious uniformity. As the years passed, the Ottoman reputation for just governance and military prowess spread throughout Anatolia and beyond. Young warriors from across the Turkish world came to serve under the Ottoman banner, drawn by the promise of adventure and the prospect of participating in what was clearly a rising power. Merchants and craftsmen established themselves in Ottoman cities, contributing to a growing prosperity that funded further expansion. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, found itself increasingly isolated and embattled. The Ottomans were not their only enemy. They faced pressure from Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms to the north, from Italian city-states seeking to expand their influence, and from internal rebellions and civil wars. Each crisis weakened the empire's ability to resist Ottoman expansion, and each Ottoman victory made further resistance seem more futile. Yet the Byzantines fought on, driven by a combination of pride, religious conviction, and the desperate hope that help would come from their Christian allies in Western Europe. They sent embassies to the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, pleading for a new crusade to save the last remnant of the Roman Empire. Some help did come, but it was never enough to turn the tide of Ottoman expansion. The Ottoman success during this period was not inevitable. There were moments when the empire might have fragmented, when stronger leadership from the Byzantines or more effective intervention from Western Europe might have checked Ottoman expansion. But the Ottomans possessed something that their enemies lacked: a clear vision of what they were trying to achieve and a systematic approach to achieving it. They understood that empire building was not just about winning battles, but about creating institutions that could survive the death of individual leaders. They recognized that lasting conquest required not just military superiority, but the ability to inspire loyalty among diverse populations. Most importantly, they combined the martial virtues of their nomadic ancestors with the administrative sophistication of the settled civilizations they encountered. By the time of Orhan's death in 1362, the Ottoman state had been transformed from a small tribal confederation into a major regional power. The tree of Osman's dream had indeed taken root, and its branches were beginning to spread across the landscape of Anatolia and into the Balkans beyond. The stage was set for the next phase of Ottoman expansion, which would see the conquest of the greatest prize of all, the city of Constantinople itself. The moon that had entered Osman's chest in that fateful dream continued to shine, its light now reflected in the growing network of Ottoman cities and the expanding circle of peoples who had chosen to cast their lot with this remarkable new empire. The greatest chapters of the Ottoman story were yet to be written, but the foundation had been laid with a care and wisdom that would serve the empire well in the centuries to come. In the spring of 1453, as the cherry blossoms were blooming in the gardens of Anatolia, and the Mediterranean breezes carried the scent of jasmine across the waters of the Bosphorus, a young man of 21 stood on a hilltop overlooking the greatest city in the world. His name was Mehmed, and though he had been Sultan of the Ottoman Empire for less than 2 years, he carried within him dreams that would have seemed impossible to anyone but the most visionary of his ancestors. Before him lay Constantinople, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the eastern bastion of Christian civilization, the heir to ancient Rome, and the greatest prize that any conqueror could imagine. Its massive walls, built by the Emperor Theodosius in the 5th century, had withstood countless sieges. Its strategic position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia made it the natural capital of any empire that sought to span both continents, and its symbolic importance as the last remnant of the Roman Empire made its conquest a dream that had haunted the imagination of Muslim rulers for 8 centuries. But Mehmed was no ordinary dreamer. Born in 1432 to Sultan Mehmed II, he had been groomed from childhood for greatness. His education had been extraordinary, even by the standards of Ottoman princes, who were already among the best educated rulers in the world. He had studied not only the traditional Islamic sciences of law, theology, and literature, but also the mathematical and engineering knowledge that was beginning to revolutionize warfare. He spoke Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin with equal fluency, and his library contained works by authors from across the known world. Most importantly, Mehmed possessed something that would prove more valuable than all his learning: an absolute, unwavering conviction that he was destined to achieve what no Muslim leader had accomplished before him. He believed, with a kind of certainty that moves mountains and conquers cities, that he would be the one to fulfill the prophecy attributed to the Prophet Muhammad himself, who had said that Constantinople would one day be conquered by a blessed army led by a blessed commander. The young sultan's opportunity came sooner than anyone might have expected. In 1451, his father Murad II died suddenly, leaving Mehmed to inherit the throne at the age of 19. Many of the empire's enemies, both internal and external, saw this as a moment of weakness. A teenage sultan, they reasoned, would be too inexperienced to maintain the empire's momentum of expansion. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, the last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, perhaps allowed himself to hope that the Ottoman threat might diminish under such young leadership. They could not have been more wrong. Mehmed's youth was not a weakness, but a source of tremendous energy and ambition. Where older rulers might have been content to consolidate their existing territories, Mehmed burned with a desire to achieve something that would make his name immortal. And he had fixed his sights on the ultimate prize, the city that controlled the gateway between Europe and Asia, the city that would transform the Ottoman Empire from a regional power into a world empire. A Constantinople that Mehmed gazed upon in 1453 was a shadow of its former glory, but it remained one of the most formidable fortresses in the world. The city's population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 souls, down from the hundreds of thousands who had once crowded its streets. Many of its magnificent buildings had fallen into disrepair, and entire districts lay abandoned. But the city's walls remained as strong as ever, and its position on a peninsula, surrounded by water on 3 sides, made it extraordinarily difficult to attack. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI was a man of courage and dignity, but he ruled over an empire that existed more in name than in reality. His territory consisted of little more than the city of Constantinople itself and a few scattered outposts. His treasury was empty, his army numbered only a few thousand men, and his appeals for help from Western Europe had yielded only token assistance. Yet he was determined to defend his inheritance to the last breath, knowing that he was not just fighting for a city, but for the survival of a civilization that stretched back over 2 millennia. Mehmed began his preparations for the siege with characteristic thoroughness. He understood that Constantinople could not be taken by conventional means. It would require innovations in both military technology and strategy. He therefore commissioned the construction of massive cannons, far larger than any that had been used in warfare before. The largest of these, cast by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, was over 27 feet long and could fire stone balls weighing more than half a ton. But artillery alone would not be enough. Mehmed also needed to solve the problem of the Golden Horn, the natural harbor that protected Constantinople's northern flank. The Byzantines had stretched a massive chain across the entrance to the harbor, preventing Ottoman ships from entering. Previous attackers had been stymied by this obstacle, but Mehmed conceived of a solution that was as audacious as it was brilliant. If his ships could not sail into the Golden Horn, he would carry them overland. In one of the most remarkable engineering feats in military history, Mehmed's engineers constructed a road of wooden planks greased with animal fat, stretching from the Bosphorus over the hills to the Golden Horn. Under cover of darkness, Ottoman sailors literally dragged their ships across this improvised portage, launching them into the harbor behind the Byzantine defenses. The psychological impact of this maneuver was perhaps even greater than its military significance. When the defenders of Constantinople awoke to find Ottoman ships in their previously secure harbor, many must have felt that they were witnessing something supernatural. How else could ships sail across dry land? The event became a symbol of Ottoman ingenuity and determination, a demonstration that no obstacle was insurmountable when faced with sufficient creativity and will. The siege that followed was a masterpiece of medieval military engineering. Mehmed's massive cannons pounded the city's walls day and night, slowly creating the breaches that would allow his infantry to assault the city. But the defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were fighting not just for their lives, but for the survival of their civilization. Again and again, they repaired the breaches in the walls, sometimes working through the night to rebuild what the Ottoman cannons had destroyed during the day. The siege lasted for 54 days, and as it progressed, it became clear that this was more than just a military campaign. It was a contest between two different visions of the future. On one side stood the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome, representing 1,000 years of Christian civilization in the East. On the other side stood the Ottoman Empire, young and dynamic, representing the rising power of Islam and the possibility of a new kind of multicultural, multi-religious empire. Throughout the siege, Mehmed demonstrated the qualities that would make him one of history's great conquerors. He was constantly present among his troops, sharing their dangers and inspiring them with his own courage. He was also a student of human nature, understanding that the capture of a city required not just military force, but the breaking of the defender's will to resist. He therefore combined the relentless pressure of his assault with carefully calculated displays of both mercy and determination. On several occasions, Mehmed sent envoys to Constantine XI, offering generous terms for surrender. The emperor and his family would be allowed to leave the city with their personal possessions, and the population would be spared the horrors of a sack. But Constantine, perhaps understanding that some things are worth more than life itself, refused these offers. He declared that he would rather die as the last emperor of the Romans than live as a pensioner of the Ottoman Sultan. The final assault came on May 29, 1453, in the gray light of dawn. Mehmed had timed the attack carefully, knowing that his troops would be fresh while the defenders would be exhausted from the long siege. The Ottoman forces attacked simultaneously, at multiple points along the walls, with the elite Janissary corps leading the charge at the main breach. The fighting was desperate and chaotic. Constantine XI, true to his word, died fighting on the walls of his city, his body so battered and stripped of its imperial regalia that it could only be identified by the purple boots that marked his rank. When the city's defenses finally collapsed, Ottoman soldiers poured through the breaches like a flood, and the last remnant of the Roman Empire came to an end after more than 2,000 years. But what happened next revealed the true character of Mehmed the Conqueror. Rather than allowing his troops to sack the city, as was customary after a siege, he quickly restored order and began the process of transforming Constantinople into the capital of a new empire. He issued proclamations guaranteeing the safety of the city's inhabitants and calling on those who had fled to return to their homes. He met with the Greek Orthodox Patriarch and confirmed the Church's right to continue its religious practices. Under Ottoman rule, most remarkably, Mehmed began immediately to repopulate the city, inviting merchants, craftsmen, and scholars from across his empire to make Constantinople their home. He understood that a great city required more than just military conquest. It needed the energy and creativity of diverse peoples working together to build something greater than themselves. The Hagia Sophia, the great church that had been the spiritual heart of Byzantine Christianity for nearly 1,000 years, was converted into a mosque, but this transformation was carried out with remarkable sensitivity to the building's history and significance. Rather than destroying the magnificent Christian mosaics that adorned its walls, Mehmed ordered them to be covered with plaster, preserving them for future generations while adapting the space for Islamic worship. The conquest of Constantinople was more than just a military victory. It was a symbolic moment that marked the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the modern age. The city that had been the eastern bastion of Christianity for over 1,000 years was now the capital of a Muslim empire that would soon stretch from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean. For Mehmed, the conquest was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream and the validation of his belief in his own destiny. He had achieved what no Muslim ruler before him had been able to accomplish, and he had done it at the age of 21. The city that had once been called the New Rome was now destined to become the heart of a new kind of empire, one that would synthesize the best elements of Islamic, Christian, and classical civilizations. The young sultan, now known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror, stood in the Hagia Sophia on that first Friday after the conquest, leading prayers in the building that had once been the greatest church in Christendom. As he knelt on the ancient marble floors, he must have felt the weight of history on his shoulders and the satisfaction of a dream fulfilled. The tree of Osman's vision had grown mighty indeed, and its branches now overshadowed the greatest city in the world. The moon that had entered his ancestor's chest in that fateful dream 2 centuries earlier now shone down on a transformed world, where the crescents and stars of the Ottoman Empire flew above the walls of Constantinople, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the story of human civilization. In the heart of what was once Constantinople, now Istanbul, there stands a building that has witnessed the prayers of emperors and sultans, the rise and fall of empires, and the eternal human search for the divine. The Hagia Sophia, whose name means holy wisdom, is more than just a monument of stone and marble. It is a living testament to the way civilizations can transform while preserving the sacred essence of what came before as the dust settled after. Mehmed's conquest in 1453, a great church that had dominated the city's skyline for nearly 1,000 years, stood at the center of a profound transformation. Built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, the Hagia Sophia had been the largest cathedral in the world for over 1,000 years, the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity and a symbol of imperial power that had inspired awe in countless pilgrims and visitors. The building itself was a marvel of engineering that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Its massive dome, nearly 180 feet high and 100 feet in diameter, appeared to float weightlessly above the nave, supported by a complex system of arches and buttresses that channeled the enormous weight down to the earth below. The interior was a symphony of light and shadow, with hundreds of windows allowing the Mediterranean sun to filter through in ever-changing patterns that seemed to make the very air itself luminous. For centuries, the Hagia Sophia had been adorned with some of the most magnificent mosaics in the world. Golden tesserae caught and reflected the light, creating images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and countless saints that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. The marble floors, polished to mirror-like smoothness, reflected these celestial scenes, creating the impression that worshippers were standing in a space that existed somewhere between heaven and earth. Mehmed first entered the Hagia Sophia. After his conquest, he was struck silent by the building's extraordinary beauty. Here was a man who had seen the finest mosques of Bursa and Edirne, who had studied the architectural wonders of the Islamic world. Yet even he was unprepared for the transcendent power of this Christian sanctuary. As he walked slowly through the vast nave, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, he must have felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. The decision of what to do with the Hagia Sophia was perhaps the most symbolically important choice that Mehmed would make as a conqueror. He could have ordered its destruction, as some of his more zealous followers urged. After all, it was a church, a symbol of the Christian empire that had just been defeated. Or he could have left it as it was, a kind of museum to the city's Christian past. But Mehmed, with the wisdom that had already marked him as an exceptional ruler, chose a third path. He would transform the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, but he would do so in a way that honored both its new Islamic identity and its ancient Christian heritage. This was not merely a practical decision, though it certainly had practical benefits. It was a profound statement about the nature of the Ottoman Empire itself. This would be a state that could embrace multiple traditions, that could transform without destroying, that could build bridges between different worlds. The conversion process began almost immediately, but it was carried out with extraordinary care and sensitivity. Rather than destroying the magnificent Christian mosaics, Mehmed ordered them to be covered with plaster and geometric patterns that accorded with Islamic artistic principles. This was not an act of vandalism, but of preservation. The mosaics would remain intact beneath their covering, waiting for future generations to rediscover their beauty. 4 minarets were added to the building's exterior, their slender towers, providing a counterpoint to the massive dome and clearly marking the building's new Islamic identity. Inside, a mihrab was installed to indicate the direction of Mecca, and a minbar was constructed from which the imam would deliver his Friday sermons. Enormous circular calligraphy panels were hung from the dome, bearing the names of Allah, Prophet Muhammad, and the first 4 caliphs in flowing Arabic script. Yet despite these changes, the essential character of the space remained unchanged. The dome still soared toward heaven with the same breathtaking majesty. The light still poured through the windows in the same ethereal patterns. The marble floors still reflected the golden glow of the overhead illumination. What had changed was not the building's capacity to inspire awe and devotion, but only the specific form that devotion would take. The first Friday prayers in the newly converted mosque drew worshippers from across the empire. Turkish soldiers who had fought in the siege knelt beside Arab merchants who had come to the city to seek their fortunes. Persian scholars shared prayer rugs with Albanian craftsmen and Greek converts who had chosen to embrace Islam. The diversity of the congregation was itself a testament to the inclusive vision that Mehmed was trying to create. As the imam's voice echoed through the vast space, reciting verses from the Quran in the melodious Arabic that had been perfected over centuries of Islamic scholarship, the building seemed to embrace its new role with the same grace it had shown as a Christian cathedral. The acoustic properties that had been designed to carry the Byzantine liturgy proved equally well suited to the Islamic call to prayer and the rhythmic recitation of Quranic verses. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Hagia Sophia's transformation was the way it came to symbolize the Ottoman approach to cultural synthesis. Rather than simply imposing their own traditions on conquered peoples, the Ottomans had developed a genius for creating new forms that honored multiple heritages simultaneously. The mosque that emerged from the conversion process was neither purely Islamic nor purely Christian, but something entirely new, a sacred space that embodied the complexity and richness of a multicultural empire. This approach would become one of the defining characteristics of Ottoman civilization. Throughout their territories, the Ottomans would encounter ancient churches, synagogues, and temples, and in each case, they would find ways to preserve what was valuable while adapting it to new circumstances. Sometimes this meant conversion, as in the case of the Hagia Sophia. Sometimes it meant protection and continued use by existing communities. Always, it meant a recognition that the empire was strengthened by its diversity rather than weakened by it. The transformation of the Hagia Sophia also marked a new phase in Ottoman architectural development. The building's perfect proportions and sublime use of space would inspire Ottoman architects for centuries to come. The great architect Mimar Sinan, who would later design some of the most beautiful mosques in the world, studied the Hagia Sophia intensively, learning from its innovative structural solutions and its masterful integration of light and space. Yet the building's influence extended far beyond architecture. It became a symbol of the Ottoman Empire's legitimacy and its claim to be the heir to both the Roman Empire and the classical Islamic caliphates. Foreign ambassadors and distinguished visitors were invariably brought to see the Hagia Sophia, and their reactions were carefully noted by Ottoman officials. The building served as a kind of diplomatic statement, a physical manifestation of the empire's power and sophistication. For the common people of Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia quickly became a beloved part of their daily lives. 5 times a day, the call to prayer would ring out from its minarets, joining with the voices of hundreds of other mosques to create a chorus that reminded the entire city of its spiritual obligations. On Fridays, the building would fill with worshippers from every corner of the empire, creating a weekly celebration of Islamic unity and Ottoman diversity. The building also became a center of learning and scholarship. The Ottoman court attached a madrasa, or Islamic school, to the mosque, where students would come to study the Quran, Islamic law, and the rich literary traditions of the Islamic world. The library that was established in connection with the school would eventually contain thousands of manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, making it one of the most important repositories of Islamic learning in the world. As the years passed, the Hagia Sophia settled into its new role with the same timeless dignity it had shown as a Christian cathedral. The building that had once echoed with the chanting of Byzantine priests now resonated with the prayers of Ottoman sultans. The space that had once been filled with the smoke of incense now carried the fragrance of rosewater and the gentle murmur of Quranic recitation. Yet beneath the surface, the building's Christian heritage remained, preserved in the covered mosaics and the fundamental architecture that had been designed to glorify the Christian God. This hidden layer of history created a kind of spiritual depth that visitors often remarked upon, a sense that the building contained multitudes, that it was somehow larger than any single religious tradition. The Hagia Sophia thus became more than just a place of worship. It became a symbol of the Ottoman Empire's unique approach to governing a diverse population. It demonstrated that it was possible to transform without destroying, to honor the past while embracing the future, to create unity without demanding uniformity. In its quiet way, the building embodied the very best of Ottoman civilization, its tolerance, its creativity, and its ability to find beauty in the synthesis of different traditions. As the centuries passed, the Hagia Sophia would continue to evolve, but it would always retain the essential character that Mehmed had given it in those crucial first years after the conquest. It would remain a bridge between worlds, a sacred space where the ancient and the modern, the Eastern and the Western, the Christian and the Islamic could coexist in harmony. The wisdom of its transformation would echo through the ages, reminding future generations that the greatest conquests are not those that destroy, but those that create something new and beautiful from the meeting of different worlds. In the gardens of the Topkapi Palace, where the morning light filtered through the leaves of ancient plane trees, and the sound of fountains provided a gentle counterpoint to the distant calls of seagulls over the Bosphorus, there walked a man who would come to embody the very essence of Ottoman greatness. His name was Suleiman, and history would remember him as the Magnificent, though his own subjects knew him by a different title, Kanuni, the lawgiver, a name that spoke to his greatest achievement, not as a conqueror, but as a builder of lasting institutions. Born in 1494, Suleiman inherited the Ottoman throne in 1520 at the age of 25, receiving from his father Selim an empire that already stretched from the Crimea to the deserts of Egypt, from the mountains of eastern Anatolia to the shores of the Adriatic. Yet what Suleiman would accomplish during his 46th year reign would transform the Ottoman Empire from a great regional power into the dominant force in the Mediterranean world, a state that European diplomats would acknowledge as the equal of any Christian monarchy. The world that Suleiman inherited was one of extraordinary opportunity and equally extraordinary challenge. To the west, the Habsburg Empire under Charles V controlled much of Central Europe and Spain, commanding resources that rivaled those of the Ottomans. To the east, the Safavid Empire in Persia presented a constant threat, not only militarily, but religiously, as the Safavids promoted Shia Islam in opposition to the Sunni orthodoxy of the Ottomans. To the south, the Mamluks had been defeated, but the vast territories of Egypt and the Levant required careful administration to integrate them fully into the Ottoman system. Yet Suleiman possessed qualities that would prove equal to these challenges. He had received an education that was remarkable even by Ottoman standards, studying not only the traditional Islamic sciences, but also the latest developments in military engineering, cartography, and statcraft. He was fluent in Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and several European languages, and his personal library contained works by authors from across the known world. Most importantly, he possessed a vision of what the Ottoman Empire could become that was both ambitious and practical, both idealistic and grounded in reality. The early years of Suleiman's reign were marked by a series of military campaigns that would establish his reputation as one of the greatest conquerors in history. His first major expedition, launched in 1521, was directed against the fortress of Belgrade, which controlled the approaches to Hungary and had long been considered impregnable. The siege of Belgrade demonstrated all of Suleiman's qualities as a military commander: his meticulous planning, his innovative use of artillery, and his ability to inspire his troops to extraordinary efforts. The fall of Belgrade sent shockwaves throughout Europe. This fortress, which had withstood countless Ottoman assaults, had fallen in just 3 weeks. The victory opened the road to Hungary and established Suleiman as a military genius whose campaigns would have to be taken with the utmost seriousness by European powers. More importantly, it demonstrated the continuing vitality of the Ottoman military machine and its ability to adapt to new challenges. But it was Suleiman's next major campaign that would truly establish his legend. In 1522, he turned his attention to the island of Rhodes, which had been held by the Knights of St. John for over 2 centuries. These crusading knights, the last remnant of the medieval crusading orders, had used Rhodes as a base for attacking Ottoman shipping and supporting Christian resistance movements throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Their expulsion would eliminate a major threat to Ottoman naval supremacy and complete the process of turning the eastern Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. The siege of Rhodes lasted for 6 months and became a legend in its own time. The Knights of St. John, led by their Grand Master Felipe Villars de Lisle Adam, defended their island fortress with extraordinary courage and skill. They were vastly outnumbered, but they possessed the advantages of strong fortifications, ample supplies, and the desperate motivation of men who knew they were fighting for their very survival, Suleiman's conduct during the siege revealed the qualities that would make him beloved by his own subjects and respected even by his enemies. Rather than simply pounding the fortress into submission, he engaged in a complex campaign of both military pressure and diplomatic negotiation. He offered generous terms to the defenders, guaranteeing their safe passage and even their personal property if they would surrender. When they refused, he prosecuted the siege with relentless efficiency, but always within the bounds of what contemporary warfare considered honorable. When the knights finally surrendered, Suleiman's treatment of them became the stuff of legend. Rather than executing them as many of his advisors urged, he allowed them to leave Rhodes with their weapons, their banners, and their personal possessions. He even provided them with ships to carry them to their new home in Malta. This gesture of magnanimity was not merely a display of royal generosity. It was a calculated demonstration of Ottoman power and confidence. Only a truly secure ruler could afford to be so generous to his defeated enemies. The expulsion of the Knights of St. John from Rhodes marked the end of the last major Christian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. From Cyprus to Crete, from the Aegean Islands to the coast of North Africa, Ottoman power was now supreme. The empire had become a truly maritime power, with a navy that could challenge European fleets anywhere in the Mediterranean. This naval supremacy would be crucial to Ottoman success in the decades to come, allowing them to project power far beyond their traditional land frontiers. But Suleiman's greatest military triumph came in 1526, when his armies invaded Hungary and won a crushing victory at the Battle of Mohacs. This engagement, which lasted only 2 hours, resulted in the death of the young Hungarian King Louis II and the collapse of organized Hungarian resistance. The victory at Mohacs opened the road to Vienna itself and established the Ottomans as a major power in Central European politics. The Battle of Mohacs was significant not only for its immediate military consequences, but for what it revealed about the evolution of Ottoman military tactics. Suleiman's army was a perfectly coordinated machine that combined traditional Ottoman cavalry charges with the latest developments in artillery and firearms. The Hungarian knights, fighting in the traditional medieval style, were simply overwhelmed by the superior firepower and tactical sophistication of the Ottoman forces. 3 years later, in 1529, Suleiman led his armies to the very gates of Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire and one of the most important cities in Christian Europe. The siege of Vienna captured the imagination of the entire continent, as Europeans realized that the Ottoman Empire had become powerful enough to threaten the very heart of Christian civilization. The siege lasted for 3 weeks, and though it ultimately failed to capture the city, it demonstrated the extent of Ottoman power and ambition. Suleiman's army had marched over 1,000 miles from Istanbul, crossed the Danube, and invested one of the strongest fortresses in Europe. The fact that Vienna held out was due less to the strength of its defenses than to the onset of winter, which forced Suleiman to withdraw his armies before the Alpine passes became impassable. Yet even in withdrawal, Suleiman's campaign had achieved its larger strategic objectives. The siege of Vienna established the Ottoman Empire as the dominant military power in southeastern Europe and forced the Habsburg emperors to treat the Ottoman Sultan as an equal. For the next 2 centuries, the Ottoman frontier would remain within striking distance of Vienna, a constant reminder of the empire's power and ambition. But perhaps Suleiman's greatest achievements were not military, but administrative. Throughout his reign, he worked tirelessly to create a system of laws and institutions that would govern his vast empire with justice and efficiency. The legal code that he promulgated, known as the Canon-i-Osmani, represented a sophisticated synthesis of Islamic law, Byzantine administrative practices, and Ottoman innovations. This code would remain the foundation of Ottoman governance for centuries to come. The Canon-i Osmani was remarkable for its comprehensiveness and its attention to detail. It covered everything from the organization of the military to the regulation of trade, from the collection of taxes to the administration of justice. Most importantly, it established clear principles of accountability and procedures that limited the arbitrary exercise of power and protected the rights of subjects, regardless of their religion or social status. Under Suleiman's rule, the Ottoman Empire reached a level of prosperity and cultural achievement that would never be equaled. The capital city of Istanbul became one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, with a population that may have exceeded 600,000 people. The city's markets were filled with goods from across the known world: spices from India, silk from China, gold from Africa, and furs from Russia. Its mosques and palaces were decorated with some of the finest examples of Islamic art and architecture ever created. The empire's cultural achievements during Suleiman's reign were equally impressive. This was the age of the great architect Mimar Sinan, whose mosques and public buildings transformed the skyline of Istanbul and established architectural principles that would influence Islamic architecture for centuries. It was also the age of the great historian Mustafa Ali, whose chronicles of Ottoman history helped establish the empire's sense of its own identity and destiny. Suleiman himself was a patron of the arts and a poet of considerable talent. He wrote verses in both Turkish and Persian, and his poetry reveals a man of deep sensitivity and spiritual insight. His court attracted scholars, artists, and musicians from across the Islamic world, creating a cultural flowering that rivaled the great courts of Baghdad and Cordoba in their prime. Perhaps most remarkably, Suleiman's reign marked the height of Ottoman religious tolerance and cultural synthesis. Christians and Jews played important roles in the empire's administration and economy, and their communities were allowed to maintain their own religious practices and internal governance. The Ottoman Empire became a refuge for Jews expelled from Spain, and many of these refugees contributed significantly to the empire's commercial and intellectual life. The empire that Suleiman governed was truly multicultural in a way that was unprecedented in the medieval world. In the streets of Istanbul, one could hear dozens of languages and see the dress and customs of peoples from 3 continents. Ottoman bureaucrats might be Greek Christians, Jewish merchants might serve as diplomatic representatives, and Islamic scholars might study texts translated from Latin or Greek. This diversity was not merely tolerated, but actively encouraged, as the Ottomans understood that their empire's strength lay in its ability to draw upon the talents and traditions of all its peoples. As Suleiman aged, he became increasingly focused on ensuring that the empire he had built would survive his death. He spent his final years consolidating his legal and administrative reforms, training his successors, and establishing institutions that would maintain Ottoman power long after his passing. When he died in 1566, during a campaign in Hungary, he left behind an empire that was larger, more prosperous, and more powerful than any Islamic state had been since the early days of the Caliphate. The reign of Suleiman the Magnificent represented the fulfillment of the dream that had begun with Osman's vision 3 centuries earlier. The tree that had been planted in the hills of Anatolia had grown into a mighty oak whose branches sheltered peoples from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean. The empire that had begun as a small band of nomadic warriors had become a world power that commanded the respect and fear of kings and emperors across 3 continents. Yet perhaps Suleiman's greatest legacy was not his conquests or his laws, but his demonstration that it was possible to build a great empire based on principles of justice, tolerance, and cultural synthesis. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman showed that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness, that different peoples could work together to create something greater than any of them could achieve alone. In an age of religious wars and ethnic conflicts, the Ottoman Empire stood as a beacon of what was possible when human beings chose cooperation over conflict, synthesis over separation. The moon that had entered Osman's chest in that fateful dream now shone down on an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Atlas Mountains to the Caucasus. The dream had become reality, and the reality had exceeded even the most optimistic hopes of the empire's founders. Under Suleiman's wise and just rule, the Ottoman Empire had truly become magnificent, a worthy heir to the great empires of the past, and a model for what the future might hold. In the gentle twilight of the 16th century, as the Ottoman Empire reached its golden zenith under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, there emerged a renaissance of beauty that would leave its mark upon the world for centuries to come. The empire was not merely a force of military might and political power, but a beacon of artistic expression that transformed stone into poetry, thread into dreams, and clay into vessels of divine inspiration. Picture, if you will, a quiet evening. In the year 1550, the sun is set over the 7 hills of Istanbul, and within the imperial workshops scattered throughout the city, skilled artisans are putting the finishing touches on their daily labors. The soft glow of oil lamps illuminates their concentrated faces as they work magic with their hands, each stroke of the brush, each turn of the potter's wheel, each thread woven into silk, contributing to a tapestry of culture that would outlast. Empires dot at the heart of this artistic flowering stood a man whose name would become synonymous with architectural genius. Mimar Sinan, the master builder whose vision transformed the Ottoman landscape. Born around 1490 in a humble village in Anatolia, Sinan began his career not as an architect, but as a soldier in the Janissary Corps. Yet destiny had greater plans for this quiet young man who possessed an eye for proportion and a soul that yearned to create beauty from stone and mortar dot. As we settle into our evening's contemplation, imagine the gentle sound of chisels against marble, the whispered prayers of craftsmen beginning their work before dawn, and the satisfied sighs of artists stepping back to admire their completed masterpieces. This was the world of Ottoman artistry, where the sacred and the beautiful intertwined like lovers in an eternal dance. Sinan's transformation from soldier to architect began in the 1530s, when his engineering skills caught the attention of Sultan Suleiman himself. The young man who had once built military bridges and fortifications was suddenly called upon to create monuments that would glorify Allah and showcase the empire's cultural sophistication. Under the patronage of the Sultan, Sinan would go on to design over 300 buildings, each one a testament to his growing mastery of form and function. The Kezaid Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1548, was what Sinan himself modestly called his apprentice work. Yet even in this early masterpiece, we can see the emergence of a distinctive Ottoman architectural style that would influence builders across 3 continents. The mosque's central dome, supported by 4 half-domes, created an interior space that seemed to float between earth and heaven. Visitors would enter through carved marble portals and find themselves in a sanctuary where light filtered through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across, prayer carpets woven with celestial motifs. But Sinan's genius truly blossomed with the construction of the Suleimani Mosque, begun in 1550 and completed 7 years later. This magnificent structure, built to honor Sultan Suleiman, represented the perfect marriage of engineering innovation and aesthetic beauty. The mosque's great dome, larger than that of Hagia Sophia, seemed to defy gravity as it soared 174 feet above the prayer hall. 4 slender minarets reached toward the sky like fingers stretched in supplication, their surfaces decorated with intricate geometric patterns that caught the light at different hours of the day within the mosque complex. Sinan created not just a place of worship, but an entire community. There were schools where children learned to read the Quran, libraries where scholars preserved ancient texts, hospitals where the sick were tended with compassion, and kitchens where the poor were, fed without charge. The architecture itself embodied the Islamic principle of caring for one's neighbors, creating spaces that served both spiritual and social needs. The construction of these monumental buildings required the coordinated efforts of thousands of skilled craftsmen. Master stonemasons from across the empire worked alongside tile makers from Iznik, whose blue and white ceramics had become legendary throughout the Islamic world. These artisans had perfected techniques for creating pottery that rivaled the finest Chinese porcelain, decorating their wares with tulips, carnations, and cypress trees that seemed to dance across the glazed surfaces in the quiet hours before dawn. As the first call to prayer echoed across the city, these ceramic artists would begin their daily work. They started with clay that had been aged for months, sometimes years, until it achieved the perfect consistency. With practiced hands, they shaped vessels that would grace the tables of sultans and the shelves of modest homes alike. The decoration process was equally meticulous, with each design hand-painted using brushes made from the finest sable hair. The famous cobalt blue that became synonymous with Ottoman ceramics was created using a secret formula that combined local minerals with techniques learned from Chinese masters. The imperial workshops also produced textiles that were coveted throughout Europe and Asia. Ottoman silk weavers created fabrics so fine that they seemed to capture moonlight in their threads. The most prized of these textiles were the kaftans worn by the Sultan and his court, garments that required months to complete, and incorporated gold and silver threads that caught the light with every movement. Palace records from the 16th century describe kaftans decorated with patterns of pomegranates, symbolic of abundance and fertility, intertwined with verses from the Quran, rendered in elegant calligraphy. Speaking of calligraphy, no discussion of Ottoman arts would be complete without acknowledging the supreme importance of beautiful writing in Islamic culture. The Ottoman court maintained a scriptorium where master calligraphers spent their days, creating manuscripts that were works of art in themselves. These scribes, many of whom were also accomplished poets, understood that their work was not merely about preserving text, but about creating visual prayers that honored the divine through beauty. The most revered of these calligraphers developed personal styles that became legendary. They would spend hours preparing their inks, grinding precious stones, and mixing pigments to achieve colors that seemed to glow from within. Their reed pens were cut and shaped with the precision of surgical instruments, each one designed to create specific line weights and flourishes. When they wrote, it was with a meditative concentration that transformed the act of writing into a form of worship. In the palace workshops, these calligraphers collaborated with miniature painters to create illustrated manuscripts that told stories. From Persian literature, Islamic history, and court chronicles, the paintings, no larger than a man's palm, contained entire worlds of detail. Artists would spend weeks painting a single figure, building up layers of color so thin that they seemed to breathe with life. These miniatures depicted gardens where every flower was botanically accurate, battle scenes where individual warriors wore distinctively patterned armor, and court ceremonies where the texture of silk and the gleam of jewels were rendered with photographic precision. The tradition of carpet weaving in the Ottoman Empire reached new heights during this period. Master weavers in cities like Bursa and Herat created carpets that were more than floor coverings. They were portable gardens that brought beauty and comfort to any space. The most skilled weavers could create carpets with over 1,000 knots per square inch, resulting in surfaces so dense and fine that they felt like velvet to the touch. These carpets often featured intricate geometric patterns based on mathematical principles that created optical illusions when viewed from different angles. The designs themselves told stories. A carpet might feature a central medallion surrounded by smaller motifs that represented the gardens of paradise. The borders often contained verses from the Quran or poetry, rendered in stylized Arabic script. The colors used in these carpets were derived from natural sources: deep reds from madder root, brilliant blues from indigo, and golden yellows from saffron. The dyeing process was a closely guarded secret, with master dyers passing their knowledge from father to son through generations. Music and poetry flourished alongside the visual arts. The Ottoman court maintained orchestras that performed for ceremonial occasions and private entertainment. These musical ensembles featured instruments that created sounds unlike anything heard in European courts. The oud, with its pear-shaped body and haunting tone; the ney, a reed flute that seemed to whisper secrets; and the kanan, a trapezoidal zither whose strings created cascades of silvery notes. The most accomplished court musicians were often composers as well, creating pieces that combined Turkish folk melodies with Persian classical forms and Arabic rhythmic patterns. These compositions were performed in the palace's music rooms, intimate spaces with perfect acoustics where the sultan and his guests could appreciate the subtle interplay of melody and rhythm. The music itself was often improvisational, with skilled musicians creating variations on established themes that reflected their individual artistry and emotional state. Poetry held an equally exalted position in Ottoman culture. The court maintained a hierarchy of poets, from apprentice versifiers to the poet laureate, who occupied a position of great honor and influence. These poets wrote in multiple languages, creating works in Turkish, Persian, and Arabic that explored themes of love, loss, spiritual longing, and the beauty of the natural world. Their verses were often set to music and performed in the palace gardens during summer evenings, when the scent of jasmine and rose petals filled the air. The greatest of these poets understood that their words were not merely entertainment, but vehicles for expressing the deepest truths of human experience. They wrote about the longing of the soul for union with the divine, using metaphors drawn from everyday life that made profound spiritual concepts accessible to common people. A poem about a nightingale singing to a rose became an allegory for the soul's yearning for God. A verse describing the morning dew on flower petals expressed the transient nature of earthly beauty and the eternal nature of divine love. As the 16th century progressed, the influence of Ottoman arts spread far beyond the empire's borders. European merchants and diplomats who visited Istanbul returned to their home countries with tales of the magnificent buildings they had seen and the exquisite objects they had acquired. Ottoman carpets became prized possessions in European palaces, and Ottoman ceramics influenced pottery makers from Italy to England. The geometric patterns that adorned Ottoman buildings inspired architects and decorators throughout the Mediterranean world. Yet for all their international influence, the Ottoman arts remained deeply rooted in Islamic spiritual traditions. Every beautiful object, every architectural detail, every line of poetry was ultimately an expression of faith and an attempt to create on earth something that reflected the perfection of the divine realm. The artists and craftsmen who created these works understood themselves to be participating in a sacred act, using their talents to honor God and to create beauty that would inspire future generations. In the quiet moments of twilight, as we reflect on this golden age of Ottoman creativity, we can imagine the satisfaction of a master craftsman completing a piece that perfectly embodied his vision. Picture the tile maker stepping back from a panel of ceramics that seemed to glow with inner light, or the carpet weaver cutting the final threads from a masterpiece that had taken months to complete. These artisans understood that their work would outlast their own brief lives, carrying forward the beauty and wisdom of their civilization to future generations, who would marvel at what human hands guided by divine inspiration could create. The legacy of Ottoman arts continues to influence our world today. The architectural principles developed by Sinan inform the work of contemporary architects who seek to create buildings that balance function with beauty. The geometric patterns that adorned Ottoman textiles and ceramics inspire modern designers who understand the timeless appeal of mathematical harmony expressed through visual art. The poetry of Ottoman court writers continues to be read and translated, offering insights into the human condition that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. As we conclude this gentle exploration of Ottoman artistic achievement, let us carry with us the understanding that true art is never merely decorative. The craftsmen and artists of the Ottoman Empire created works that served both practical and spiritual purposes, objects that were beautiful to look at and meaningful to contemplate. They understood that beauty itself is a form of prayer, a way of honoring the divine through the transformation of raw materials into objects that inspire wonder and reverence. In the stillness of this evening hour, as we prepare to continue our journey through the long twilight of the Ottoman Empire, we can rest assured that the beauty created by these long-ago artisans continues to enrich our world. Their works remind us that human creativity, when guided by faith and dedication, can produce objects that seem to transcend the limitations of their materials and touch something eternal in the human spirit. The gentle night breeze carries with it the echo of ancient hammers shaping metal, the whisper of brushes applying paint to ceramic surfaces, and the quiet satisfaction of artists who understood that their work was both craft and prayer, both profession and devotion. In this understanding, we find a timeless truth about the relationship between beauty and meaning, between human creativity and divine inspiration, that remains as relevant today as it was in the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. As the evening deepens and our journey through the Ottoman Empire continues, we turn our attention to one of the most fascinating and complex aspects of this remarkable civilization, the unique social structure that bound together peoples of different faiths, languages, and backgrounds into a single functioning empire. At the heart of this system stood an institution that would seem almost impossible to imagine in our modern world: the Janissary Corps, an elite military force recruited through a practice that transformed Christian boys into the Sultan's most trusted soldiers. Picture, if you will, a crisp autumn morning in the year 1520, somewhere in the rolling hills of the Balkans. A small convoy of Ottoman officials has arrived in a Serbian village, their presence both feared and reluctantly accepted by the local population. They have come to collect what was known as the devshirm, literally meaning the gathering, a practice that would forever change the lives of young boys and, paradoxically, offer them opportunities that would have been unimaginable in their humble village origins. The devshirm system, which began in the 14th century and continued well into the 17th, was unlike anything seen in other empires of the time. Every 40 households in Christian communities throughout the Balkans and later other parts of the empire would be required to give up one boy, typically between the ages of 8 and 20, to serve in the Sultan's administration. This was not mere conquest or slavery as we might understand it today, but rather a carefully orchestrated system that would create the backbone of Ottoman administration and military might. As we settle into our evening contemplation, imagine the complex emotions that must have filled these villages on collection day. Mothers would wake before dawn to prepare their sons for a journey into the unknown, braiding their hair one last time, packing small bundles of belongings that would serve as their only connection to home. The boys themselves, some barely old enough to understand what was happening, would be torn between fear and a sense of adventure, not knowing that they were about to embark on a transformation that would make them among the most powerful men in the world's greatest empire. The selection process was meticulous and revealing of Ottoman administrative sophistication. Only boys with no physical defects were chosen for military training, as the empire understood that its elite forces required perfect physical specimens. The Ottoman officials conducting the devshirm were trained to recognize not just physical fitness, but also signs of intelligence, character, and potential leadership ability. They sought boys who displayed quick thinking, courage, and the kind of innate dignity that could be cultivated into the bearing of a future pasha or grand vizier. Once selected, these boys began a journey that would completely transform their identities. They were taken from their Christian families and villages, converted to Islam, and given Turkish names to mark their new beginning. Yet this conversion was not forced in the brutal manner we might expect. Instead, it was presented as an opportunity for spiritual and social elevation. The boys were taught that they were being chosen for a higher purpose, to serve not just any ruler, but the Sultan, who was considered the shadow of God on earth. That the training process was as remarkable as the selection. The most promising boys were sent to Turkish families for 4 to 8 years of cultural immersion before beginning their military training at Gallipoli. During this period, they learned not just the Turkish language and Islamic customs, but also the subtle art of Ottoman courtly behavior. They discovered how to move with grace and dignity, how to speak with eloquence and restraint, and how to navigate the complex social hierarchies that governed Ottoman society. For those destined to become janissaries, the military training that followed was intensive and transformative. The training camps were located in strategic locations throughout the empire, but the most famous was at Gallipoli, where young men learned the arts of warfare that would make them the most feared soldiers in Europe. They mastered the use of firearms, which were still relatively new in European warfare, and learned the disciplined formations that would allow them to break the cavalry charges of traditional European armies. But the janissaries were more than just soldiers. They were members of a unique military brotherhood that combined elements of a religious order, a professional army, and a social club. They lived in barracks that were designed not just for military efficiency, but for fostering the bonds of camaraderie that would hold them together through the hardships of campaign and battle. They shared meals from a common pot, symbolic of their unity and mutual dependence. And they developed a culture of honor and loyalty that made them fiercely devoted to their sultan and to each other. The social structure of the Ottoman Empire was built around this principle of merit-based advancement through service to the state. Ottoman society was divided between Muslims and non-Muslims, with Muslims theoretically having a higher standing, but the reality was far more complex and nuanced than this simple division might suggest. The empire created a system where talent and dedication could elevate individuals from the humblest origins to positions of immense power and influence. At the apex of this system stood the Sultan himself, considered not just a political ruler, but a spiritual leader whose authority came directly from God. The Sultan's word was law, but he was expected to govern according to Islamic principles and the accumulated wisdom of Ottoman legal tradition. Below the Sultan was the Grand Vizier, essentially the prime minister of the empire, who managed the day-to-day administration of this vast domain. The title Grand Vizier was created to distinguish the holder of the Sultan's seal from other high-ranking officials, and the position carried with it enormous responsibility and power. Many of the most successful Grand Viziers were themselves products of the Devshirme system. Ibrahim Pasha, who served as Grand Vizier from 1523 to 1536, played a decisive role in diplomatic and military events during the reign of Sultan Suleiman. His story illustrates the remarkable social mobility that the Ottoman system made possible. Born in a small town in the Balkans, he rose through the ranks of the Devshirme system to become one of the most powerful men in the empire, eventually marrying into the royal family and accumulating wealth and influence that rivaled that of European monarchs. The provincial governors, known as pashas, formed another crucial layer of Ottoman administration. The title of pasha was given to provincial governors and the viziers of the central administration, and these men were responsible for maintaining order and collecting taxes across the empire's vast territories. Many of these governors were also products of the Devshirme system, creating a network of administrators who shared common training and values despite governing populations that spoke different languages and followed different customs. The genius of the Ottoman system lay in its ability to create loyalty through opportunity rather than coercion. The boys taken through the Devshirme system were given chances for advancement that would have been impossible in their original circumstances. A Serbian peasant's son could become a pasha governing Egypt. A shepherd's boy from Bulgaria could rise to become Grand Vizier, commanding armies and negotiating with European kings as an equal. This possibility of advancement created a dynamic energy throughout the empire, as capable individuals at all levels strove to prove their worth and earn promotion. The Janissaries themselves embodied this principle of merit-based advancement. Within the corps, promotion was based on demonstrated ability in combat, loyalty to the Sultan, and skill in the various military arts. A common soldier could rise to become an officer, and officers could advance to positions of command that carried with them not just military authority, but also significant political influence. The most successful Janissary commanders often transitioned into civilian administration, becoming governors or even grand viziers. This system created a unique form of social mobility that distinguished the Ottoman Empire from its European contemporaries. While European societies were still largely based on hereditary privilege, where birth determined destiny, the Ottoman system created pathways for advancement based on talent and service. This was not a democracy in any modern sense, but it was a meritocracy that rewarded ability and dedication regardless of origin. The religious dimension of this system cannot be overlooked. The conversion of Devshirme boys to Islam was not merely a political requirement, but a spiritual transformation that was meant to create a new form of identity. These young men were taught that their service to the Sultan was a form of worship, that their military and administrative duties were religious obligations that would be rewarded in the afterlife. This spiritual dimension gave their service a sense of purpose and meaning that went beyond mere career advancement. The training of these future leaders extended far beyond military and administrative skills. They were educated in literature, poetry, mathematics, and the arts, creating a ruling class that was both cultivated and competent. A typical pasha might be equally comfortable discussing Persian poetry, negotiating a trade agreement, or leading a military campaign. This broad education created leaders who could understand and govern the diverse populations of the empire with wisdom and sensitivity. The social structure of the Ottoman Empire also accommodated the empire's religious diversity through the millet system, which allowed different religious communities to govern their own internal affairs. Christians and Jews formed semi-autonomous communities within the empire, with their own religious leaders, courts, and customs. This system created a form of pluralism that was remarkable for its time, allowing different faiths to coexist within a single political framework. The success of this system can be measured by the longevity and stability of Ottoman rule. For over 6 centuries, this empire maintained control over territories that spanned 3 continents and included dozens of different ethnic and religious groups. The administrative structure created through the Devshirme system and the broader Ottoman social hierarchy provided the framework for this remarkable achievement. Yet the very success of the system contained the seeds of its eventual transformation. As the empire matured and became more prosperous, the rigid meritocracy of the early period began to give way to more traditional forms of hereditary privilege. In the late 16th century, the Janissary system changed, permitting soldiers to marry, pass their positions to their sons, and allowing new recruits from Turkish families. This change marked the beginning of a gradual transformation that would eventually alter the character of the empire. The decline of the Devshirme system and the transformation of the Janissary corps reflected broader changes in Ottoman society. As the empire reached its territorial limits and faced new challenges from European powers, the need for constant military expansion diminished. The Janissaries, who had been created for conquest and expansion, found themselves in a changing world where their traditional role was less relevant. They began to involve themselves in politics and commerce, sometimes becoming a source of instability rather than strength. Despite these later challenges, the Ottoman social system at its height represented one of the most sophisticated and successful experiments in imperial administration in human history. The ability to transform conquered children into loyal administrators and soldiers, to create a meritocracy based on service rather than birth, and to maintain stability across such a diverse and vast territory demonstrated a level of political and social innovation that was centuries ahead of its time. As we reflect on this remarkable system in the quiet of our evening contemplation, we can appreciate both its achievements and its complexities. The Devshirme system and the Janissary cores were products of their time, reflecting values and assumptions that we might find difficult to accept today. Yet they also demonstrated possibilities for social mobility and cultural integration that were revolutionary for their era. The legacy of this system extends far beyond the Ottoman Empire itself. The principle of merit-based advancement, the idea that talent and dedication should determine social position rather than birth, became one of the foundational concepts of modern democratic societies. The Ottoman experiment in creating a diverse, multi-ethnic empire governed by shared principles and institutions provided lessons that continue to influence political thought and practice today. In the gentle twilight of our historical journey, we can see in the Ottoman social system a reflection of humanity's eternal struggle to create just and effective forms of governance. The empire's success in transforming diversity into strength, in creating loyalty through opportunity, and in maintaining stability through adaptability, offers insights that remain relevant in our own complex and interconnected world as we prepare to continue our exploration of this remarkable civilization. We carry with us an appreciation for the human capacity to create systems that transcend the limitations of their time and circumstances. The boys who walked away from their village homes to serve in the Sultan's court remind us that individual destiny is often shaped by larger historical forces, but that human adaptability and resilience can transform even the most dramatic changes into opportunities for growth and achievement. The quiet night holds within it the echoes of marching feet, the rustle of silk robes in palace corridors, and the whispered prayers of soldiers preparing for battle. In these sounds, we hear the heartbeat of a civilization that dared to imagine new forms of human organization, and for a time, made those dreams a reality that shaped the course of world history. As our evening journey through the Ottoman Empire deepens, we now find ourselves approaching the most intimate and mysterious heart of imperial power, the Topkapi Palace and its legendary harem. Here, behind walls of marble and gates of silver, unfolded the private lives of sultans and the women who, despite living in seclusion, wielded influence that shaped the destiny of nations. In the soft glow of our contemplative hour, let us step quietly through these sacred halls where love, ambition, and power intertwined like threads in an imperial tapestry. Imagine, if you will, a misty morning in the year 1540, when the sun first touches the gilded domes of Topkapi Palace overlooking the Bosphorus. The palace, begun by Mehmed II in 1459, has grown over the decades into a sprawling complex that seems to float between sky and sea, its gardens perfumed with jasmine and rose petals, its courtyards echoing with a gentle splash of fountains, and the whispered conversations of those who serve the Sultan. This is not merely a residence, but a world unto itself, where the rhythms of daily life follow protocols established by centuries of tradition. The palace's architecture reflects the Ottoman understanding of power and privacy, with 4 consecutive Courtyards surrounded by high walls, each serving different purposes and separated by gates that incrementally restricted entry, culminating in the most private third and fourth courtyards. As we walk through these spaces in our imagination, we can feel the weight of increasing solemnity with each gate we pass, each courtyard drawing us deeper into the sacred center of Ottoman rule. The first courtyard, known as the Court of the Janissaries, was the only area open to the public during the Ottoman era. Here, common people could petition for justice, merchants could conduct business, and visitors could glimpse the outer workings of imperial administration. Yet even in this most accessible space, the atmosphere was one of respectful quiet, for the palace maintained strict protocols that ensured the sultan's dignity was preserved even in the most mundane interactions. Moving deeper into the palace, we encounter the second courtyard, the Divan Square, where the empire's highest officials gathered for council meetings. Here, beneath the shade of ancient plane trees, the Grand Vizier and other ministers would discuss matters of state while servants moved silently among them, offering sherbet and coffee in cups of finest porcelain. The buildings surrounding this courtyard housed the palace kitchens, where hundreds of cooks prepared meals for the thousands of residents and visitors who populated this city within a city. But it is the third and fourth courtyards that hold our deepest fascination. For here lay the Sultan's private apartments and the world of the imperial harem. The harem, built towards the end of the 16th century, consisted of around 400 magnificently tiled rooms and chambers connected by courtyards and gardens with fountains, and was home to over 1,000 women, children, eunuchs, and their servants. The very word harem comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred, and indeed, this was a space so private that no man except the Sultan, his young sons, and the black eunuchs who served as guards could enter dot as we slipped quietly. Through these hushed corridors in our mind's eye, we can almost hear the rustle of silk against marble floors, the soft laughter of children at play, and the whispered conversations of women whose lives were shaped by the complex hierarchies of palace life. The walls themselves seemed to hold memories of midnight conversations between the Sultan and his mother, of young concubines learning the arts of music and poetry, of the valid Sultan conducting the delicate diplomacy that kept the imperial household functioning smoothly. The architecture of the harem reflects the Ottoman genius for creating beauty within constraint. Many rooms were designed by Mimar Sinan, the empire's greatest architect, who understood how to create spaces that were both intimate and grand, private yet magnificent. The walls are covered with tiles from Iznik, their blues and whites creating patterns that seem to shift and dance in the changing light. Windows are screened with wooden lattice, allowing the women to observe the world outside while remaining themselves unseen. Courtyards are designed around fountains whose gentle murmur provides both beauty and privacy, masking conversations from unwanted ears. Within this secluded world, a complex society functioned according to its own rules and hierarchies. At its apex stood the valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who wielded enormous influence not just within the harem, but throughout the empire. She was responsible for the education and advancement of the other women, serving as a mentor and guide to those who showed promise. Her apartments were the most luxurious in the harem, reflecting her status as the most powerful woman in the empire. Below the valid Sultan in the hierarchy came the Sultan's wives and favorite concubines, each competing for the Sultan's attention and affection. These women were not merely ornamental. They were educated in literature, music, and the arts, often becoming accomplished poets and musicians in their own right. The most successful among them could rise to positions of considerable influence, advising the Sultan on matters of state and using their positions to advance the interests of their families and supporters. The story of Harem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, illustrates the remarkable possibilities that existed within this system. She was a concubine who had been captured from Ruthenia, now Ukraine, and sold as a slave. But she entered as a concubine in the harem and rose through the ranks, becoming the Sultan's favorite and ending up being one of the most powerful and influential women in Ottoman history. Her intelligence, beauty, and political acumen caught the attention of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and their relationship became one of the great love stories of the Ottoman Empire. Hurrem's rise to power was unprecedented. She became the first concubine to be legally married to a reigning sultan, and her influence extended far beyond the harem walls. She corresponded with European royalty, funded the construction of mosques and charitable institutions, and played a crucial role in the empire's diplomatic relations. Her apartments in the harem were decorated with the finest tiles, carpets, and furnishings, reflecting her status as the sultan's beloved partner and trusted advisor. The daily life of the harem followed rhythms that had been established over centuries. The day began before dawn with the call to prayer, when the women would perform their morning devotions in the harem's own mosque. After prayer came the first meal of the day, served in the communal dining halls where the women would gather to share food and conversation. The hierarchical nature of harem society was reflected even in these simple moments, with the most favored women receiving the choicest dishes and the most comfortable seating. The morning hours were often devoted to education and self-improvement. The women would study poetry, learn to play musical instruments, and practice the delicate arts of embroidery and calligraphy. Teachers and tutors, usually eunuchs or older women, would instruct the younger concubines in the skills they would need to catch the sultan's attention and advance within the palace hierarchy. The most promising students might be selected for special training, learning languages, diplomacy, and the subtle arts of influence that would serve them well in their future roles. The afternoon brought leisure and relaxation. The women might walk in the harem's private gardens, where flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds and fountains, created cool, restful spaces for contemplation. They might bathe in the elaborate hammams, where skilled attendants would massage them with perfumed oils and dress their hair in the elaborate styles that were fashionable at court. These baths were not merely hygienic necessities, but social occasions where friendships were formed and alliances were negotiated. The evenings were perhaps the most significant time of day in the harem, for it was then that the sultan might choose to visit. The selection of a companion for the evening was a carefully choreographed process that involved the valid sultan, the head eunuch, and other senior officials. The chosen woman would be prepared with the utmost care, dressed in the finest silks and jewels, and escorted to the sultan's chambers by a procession of attendants. These encounters were not merely personal but political, for they offered opportunities for the women to influence the sultan's decisions and advance their own interests. The children born in the harem occupied a special position in Ottoman society. The sultan's sons were potential heirs to the throne, and their education was carefully supervised by the palace tutors. They lived in the harem until they reached adolescence, when they were moved to separate quarters and began their preparation for adult responsibilities. The daughters were equally important, for their marriages could create important diplomatic alliances and strengthen the empire's relationships with other powers. The architecture of the harem was designed to accommodate this complex social structure. The sultan's private apartments were located at the center of the complex, surrounded by the rooms of his wives and favorites. Beyond these were the quarters of the other concubines, arranged in a hierarchy that reflected their status and prospects. The servants' quarters were located on the periphery, and the whole complex was connected by a network of corridors and passages that allowed for movement, while maintaining the privacy that was essential to the harem's function. The decoration of these spaces reflected the Ottoman love of beauty and luxury. The walls were covered with tiles that depicted flowering gardens, geometric patterns, and verses from the Quran rendered in elegant calligraphy. The floors were covered with carpets of the finest weave, and the windows were fitted with screens of carved wood that filtered the light while providing privacy. The furniture was low and comfortable, designed for the Ottoman way of life that emphasized relaxation and contemplation. The gardens of the harem were particularly beautiful, designed as earthly representations of paradise. They featured fountains that created music as they played, flower beds that bloomed in carefully planned sequences throughout the year, and trees that provided shade and privacy. These gardens were not merely decorative, but served as outdoor living spaces where the women could escape the confines of their rooms and enjoy the beauty of nature within the safety of the palace walls. The administration of the harem was as complex as that of any government ministry. The head eunuch, known as the Kisler Aga, was responsible for the security and organization of the entire complex. He supervised a staff of subordinate eunuchs who served as guards, messengers, and administrators. The valid sultan had her own staff of servants and advisors, and each of the sultan's wives maintained her own household within the larger structure of the harem. The economic impact of the harem was enormous. The women required clothing, jewelry, food, and other necessities that were provided by craftsmen and merchants throughout the empire. The most skilled seamstresses, jewelers, and perfumers competed for the privilege of serving the imperial household, and their work set the standards for luxury and refinement throughout Ottoman society. The harem's demands for silk, spices, and other luxury goods created trade networks that stretched across the known world. Yet for all its luxury and beauty, the harem was also a place of constraint and limitation. The women who lived there, no matter how honored or influential, were prisoners of their own privilege. They could not leave the palace grounds without special permission, and their contacts with the outside world were carefully controlled. Their lives were shaped by the will of the sultan and the complex politics of palace life, and their futures depended on their ability to navigate these treacherous waters successfully. The influence of the harem extended far beyond its walls. The women who lived there often maintained correspondence with family members and supporters throughout the empire, creating networks of information and influence that could affect policy and politics. The charitable institutions they founded, the mosques they built, and the scholars they sponsored all contributed to the cultural and intellectual life of the empire. Their taste in art, fashion, and decoration influenced styles throughout Ottoman society, and their patronage supported artists and craftsmen who created some of the empire's most beautiful works. As our evening contemplation draws us deeper into the mysteries of this remarkable institution, we begin to understand that the harem was not merely a place of luxury and indulgence, but a complex society that reflected the broader patterns of Ottoman civilization. It was a world where East met West, where different cultures and traditions blended to create something new and unique. The women who lived there came from all corners of the empire and beyond, bringing with them their own languages, customs, and perspectives, which they shared and adapted within the cosmopolitan environment of the palace. The legacy of the harem extends far beyond the Ottoman Empire itself. The institution influenced the development of women's roles in Islamic societies, created new forms of political influence and cultural expression, and contributed to the evolution of architectural and decorative arts. The stories of the remarkable women who lived there continue to inspire writers, artists, and filmmakers, and their example reminds us that power and influence can take many forms, even within the most constrained circumstances. In the gentle twilight of our historical journey, we can still sense the presence of these long-vanished women in the empty corridors of Topkapi Palace. Their laughter echoes in the courtyards, their footsteps whisper across the marble floors, and their dreams seem to shimmer in the play of light and shadow through the latticed windows. They remind us that behind every great empire stand not just the famous sultans and generals whose names fill the history books, but also the countless individuals, women and men, powerful and humble, whose lives and choices shaped the course of civilizations. The harem of Topkapi Palace stands as a testament to the complexity of human societies and the endless capacity for adaptation and creativity that allows people to find meaning and purpose even within the most restrictive circumstances. As we prepare to continue our journey through the long twilight of the Ottoman Empire, we carry with us an appreciation for the rich tapestry of lives that were lived within these walls, and for the ways in which the private and the public, the personal and the political, intertwined to create the magnificent and complex civilization that was the Ottoman Empire. The night breeze carries with it the scent of jasmine from the palace gardens, the whisper of silk against marble, and the echo of forgotten conversations that once shaped the destiny of nations. In these gentle sounds, we hear the heartbeat of a world that existed at the intersection of dreams and reality, where love and power danced together in the shadows of history. Time moves like the gentle current of the Bosphorus, carrying even the mightiest empires toward their twilight. As we settle deeper into our evening's journey, let us witness how the great Ottoman Empire, once the terror and wonder of 3 continents, began to show the first silver threads in its magnificent tapestry. The 17th century dawned with different light than the golden age of Suleiman. In the quiet halls of Topkapi Palace, where once the sound of urgent messengers echoed with news of fresh conquests, a softer sound had taken hold, the whisper of silk slippers on marble floors, the gentle rustle of pages turning in books of poetry rather than battle plans. Sultan Ibrahim the Mad ruled during these changing times, and his reign spoke of an empire that had grown weary of its own greatness. Like an old oak tree that has weathered countless storms, the Ottoman state was magnificent still, but its roots had begun to shift in soil that no longer nourished as it once had. The sultans, once warriors who led their armies from the front lines, now preferred the perfumed gardens of their palaces to the dust of campaign routes. Picture, if you will, a sultan reclining on cushions of the finest silk, surrounded by the treasures of 100 conquered cities. The room glows with the warm light of 1,000 candles, their flames dancing like the spirits of past glories. But outside the palace walls, the empire's pulse had begun to slow. The increasing lack of ability and power of the sultans themselves became an important factor in the decline, as they withdrew more and more from public affairs to devote themselves to the pleasures of their harem, the janissaries. Once the empire's pride and the terror of Christian Europe had grown comfortable in their barracks. These elite soldiers, who had once marched across the snowy passes of the Balkans singing hymns of victory, now spent their days in the coffee houses of Istanbul, discussing politics and trade rather than tactics and conquest. Their white felt caps, once seen only on the bloodiest battlefields, now bobbed gently as they played backgammon in the afternoon sun. Imagine walking through the grand bazaar of Constantinople in those days. The air still carried the scent of cinnamon and cardamom, rose water and fine leather. Merchants from Persia still spread their carpets like jeweled meadows, and the goldsmiths still hammered their delicate patterns into precious metals. But something had changed in the rhythm of commerce. The Ottoman economy was disrupted by inflation, caused by the influx of precious metals into Europe from the Americas and by an increasing imbalance of trade between East and West, not the great ships that had once brought the wealth of the Indies. To Ottoman ports now sailed past, heading for the harbors of Venice, Genoa, and the rising ports of the Atlantic nations. Spain's silver from the New World had changed the very nature of money itself, making the gold that had once made the Ottomans rich seem somehow less valuable, like flowers that fade when newer blooms appear in the garden dot in the provincial cities. Of the empire, far from the marble splendor of the capital, governors grew bold and distant. Like feudal lords of old Europe, They began to rule their territories as personal kingdoms, sending less and less tribute to the central treasury. The empire's vast communication network, once as efficient as the flight of eagles, began to slow to the pace of oxen plodding through mud. The great fortress cities along the Danube, those mighty sentinels that had once struck fear into the hearts of Habsburg armies, now required more gold for their upkeep than they generated through conquest. The mathematics of empire had shifted, and the ledgers told a story that the old songs of victory could no longer drown out. But even in decline, there was beauty. The Ottoman spirit, like a sunset over the Golden Horn, painted the sky with colors that seemed almost more beautiful for their transience. The empire's artisans, freed from the demands of constant warfare, created works of art that whispered rather than shouted, like the delicate tulip motifs that began to appear on tiles and textiles, speaking of gardens rather than battlefields. Great Ottoman historian Naima wrote during these times with the melancholy wisdom of one who had seen both the height of summer and the first chill of autumn. His chronicles read like letters from a distant friend, describing how the empire's very success had become a kind of burden. The vast territories that had once been sources of strength now stretched the empire's resources thin, like a carpet pulled too wide, showing the threads beneath. In the palace gardens, where once the sound of military drums had echoed through the morning air, now only the gentle splash of fountains and the soft call of peacocks disturbed the growing quiet. The sultans still held court, still wore robes that sparkled with the wealth of nations, but their edicts now concerned the proper cultivation of tulips as much as the movement of armies. The empire's enemies, sensing this change like wolves scenting the wind, began to press closer. The Habsburg eagles circled from the west, the Russian bear lumbered down from the north, and the Persian lion watched from the east. Yet still the Ottoman crescent moon hung in the sky, still beautiful, still commanding respect, but perhaps not quite as bright as it had been in the days when Suleiman's armies had camped beneath the walls of Vienna. In the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire faced threats on numerous frontiers from multiple industrialized European powers as well as internal instabilities. Outsider influence, rise of nationalism, and internal corruption demanded the empire to look within itself and modernize. The empire's leaders, like gardeners tending an ancient tree, began to understand that new growth would require new methods. The great libraries of the empire, those repositories of wisdom gathered from conquered civilizations, began to fill with new kinds of books. Treatises on European military tactics appeared alongside the traditional texts of Islamic jurisprudence. Maps of the world showed new lands and new seas, suggesting that the world had grown larger while the empire had remained the same size. In the coffee houses of Istanbul, where the empire's intellectuals gathered to discuss the events of the day, conversations turned increasingly to questions that had no easy answers. How could an empire built on conquest survive in a world where the rules of power were changing? How could a state founded on the idea of holy war adapt to an age of trade and diplomacy? The empire's poets during this period wrote with a beauty born of uncertainty, their verses carrying the weight of questions that their grandfathers had never needed to ask. They wrote of roses that bloomed in winter, of stars that shone more brightly as the sky grew dark, of love that deepened with lost. As our chapter draws to a close, we leave the Ottoman Empire not in shame or defeat, but in the quiet dignity of a great power learning to live with its own mortality. After the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was shrinking as Russia put on heavy pressure and expanded to its south. Egypt became effectively independent in 1805, and the British later took it over, along with Cyprus. Greece became independent, and Serbia and other Balkan areas became highly autonomous. The empire that had once seemed as eternal, as the stars was discovering that even stars must eventually dim, not through failure, but through the natural progression of time itself. Like an elderly storyteller who has told 1,000 tales, the Ottoman Empire was beginning to understand that its greatest stories might already have been told, and that wisdom lay not in fighting this truth, but in accepting it with grace. As the 19th century dawned over the Bosphorus, a different kind of light began to filter through the latticed windows of the Ottoman palaces. It was not the harsh glare of conquest or the soft glow of decline, but something altogether new, the uncertain light of transformation, flickering like a candle in a room where the old furniture was being rearranged in the quiet chambers of Topkapi Palace, where for centuries the rhythm of empire had been measured in the steady beat of tradition. A new sound began to emerge. It was the rustling of European newspapers, the scratch of pens drafting edicts that would have been unthinkable to earlier sultans, and the soft footsteps of advisors who spoke of ideas that came from beyond the empire's ancient borders. Sultan Mehmed II, who ruled during these pivotal years, was a man caught between two worlds. Picture him in the early morning light, standing at a window that overlooked the Golden Horn, his traditional Ottoman robes replaced by a European-style uniform. His reflection in the glass seemed to embody the empire itself, part ancient, part modern, wholly uncertain of what it was becoming. The most dramatic change came in 1826, when Mahmud II made a decision that would echo through the marble halls of history. The Janissaries, those white-capped warriors who had once been the empire's pride, had become a source of rebellion and resistance to change. Like gardeners who must sometimes cut away dead branches to save the tree, the Sultan ordered their complete destruction. The event was known as the Auspicious Incident, though there was nothing auspicious about the blood that stained the stones of the Hippodrome that day. But from this dramatic pruning, new growth began to emerge. The empire that had once rejected European ideas as foreign weeds now began to cultivate them like rare flowers in an imperial garden. The Tanzimat reforms, beginning in 1839, represented the most ambitious attempt to transform the Ottoman Empire. From within, imagine walking through Istanbul during these years of change. The city still retained its essential character. The call to prayer still echoed 5 times daily across the 7 hills. The bazaars still hummed with the languages of a dozen nations, and the Bosphorus still sparkled like scattered diamonds in the afternoon sun. But new elements had been woven into this ancient tapestry. European-style military academies rose beside traditional madrasas, their red brick walls housing young Ottoman men who learned to march in formation and calculate artillery trajectories. The primary purpose of the Tanzimat was to reform the military by modernizing and taking inspiration from European armies. As the traditional Ottoman army, the Janissaries, had fallen from grace in terms of military prestige, the Grand Vizier, Mustafa Rezid Pasha, architect of these reforms, moved through the halls of power like a man walking between raindrops. He understood that the empire must change or perish, yet he also knew that change too rapid could shatter the very foundations of Ottoman society. His reforms were like a careful translation between languages, preserving the meaning while transforming the expression. These reforms, heavily influenced by European ideas, were intended to effectuate a fundamental change of the empire from the old system based on theocratic principles to that of a modern state. The famous Hatwai Zarif of Gulhain, proclaimed in 1839, promised equality before the law for all Ottoman subjects, regardless of their religion or ethnicity. This was revolutionary for an empire that had been built on a clear distinction between Muslim rulers and non-Muslim subjects. Picture the scene in the palace gardens where this historic edict was read aloud. Diplomats from Europe stood beside Ottoman pashas, their formal mourning coats a stark contrast to the flowing robes of tradition. The words that floated on the morning air spoke of concepts that would have seemed impossible to Suleiman the Magnificent: equality, individual rights, and the rule of law above the rule of men. The government's series of constitutional reforms led to a fairly modern conscripted army, banking system reforms, the decriminalization of homosexuality, the replacement of religious law with secular law, and guilds with modern factories. These changes rippled through Ottoman society like stones dropped in still water, creating circles of effect that touched every corner of the empire. The Ottoman postal system, established during this period, became a symbol of the empire's attempt to bind its vast territories together with threads of communication rather than chains of conquest. Letters now traveled from Baghdad to Bucharest, from Cairo to Crete, carrying not just personal messages, but the ideas that would reshape the Ottoman world. Yet the reformers were handicapped by a lack of money and skilled men, and they were opposed by traditionalists who argued that the reformers were destroying the empire's fundamental Islamic character. In the coffee houses of Istanbul, debates raged like winter storms. Some argued that the empire was losing its soul in pursuit of European approval, while others insisted that adaptation was the only path to survival. The empire's financial troubles deepened during this period, like a beautiful palace slowly sinking into debt. The costs of modernization, new armies, new schools, new infrastructure far exceeded the empire's traditional sources of revenue. European bankers, with their precise calculations and relentless interest rates, became as influential in Ottoman affairs as any pasha or general. Meanwhile, in the provinces, the winds of nationalism began to blow. The Greek War of Independence, which had begun in 1821, had shown that the empire's diverse populations could imagine themselves as separate nations rather than Ottoman subjects. The idea of the nation-state, imported from Europe like a new fashion, began to take root in Balkan soil. In Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania, local leaders began to dream of independence, their aspirations nurtured by European powers who saw opportunity in Ottoman weakness. The empire that had once been a melting pot of cultures now faced the possibility of breaking apart along ethnic and religious lines. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 brought this transformation into sharp focus. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire found itself allied with the great powers of Europe against Russia. Ottoman soldiers fought alongside British and French troops, their uniforms now cut in European style, their tactics learned from European manuals. The war was won, but at a cost that went beyond mere finances. It made clear that the empire's survival now depended on European support. Education, too, began to change during this period. New schools opened their doors to teach not just Islamic jurisprudence and Arabic literature, but also mathematics, geography, and European languages. Young Ottoman men traveled to Paris and London to study, returning with ideas that sometimes fit poorly with the world they had left behind. The printing press, long resisted by traditional scribes, now began to transform Ottoman intellectual life. Books and newspapers proliferated, carrying debates and discussions that would have been impossible in earlier centuries. The empire's educated elite began to read European novels, study European philosophy, and question assumptions that had gone unchallenged for centuries. Yet, for all these changes, the Ottoman Empire remained recognizably itself. The call to prayer still echoed across the Golden Horn. The Sultan still held court in ceremonies that dated back to the 15th century, and the great mosques still drew worshippers from across the Islamic world. The empire was changing, but it was changing as itself, not trying to become something entirely different. The Tanzimat was a period of societal reforms, undertaken by the Ottoman Empire to combat economic decline and the gradual loss of territory, involving sweeping changes to social structure and human rights, liberating large numbers of people from servitude and opening a path to citizenship. As our chapter draws to a close, we see the Ottoman Empire at a crossroads, like a traveler who has stopped at an inn between two destinations. The empire had begun the difficult work of transformation, but the path ahead remained uncertain. The reforms had created new possibilities, but they had also created new problems. The attempt to modernize while remaining true to Ottoman traditions was like trying to sing a new song to an ancient melody, sometimes harmonious, sometimes discordant, always challenging. The empire's leaders understood that they were living through a time of unprecedented change, but they could not have foreseen how these changes would ultimately lead to the empire's dissolution. They were like skilled gardeners tending a great tree, not realizing that their careful pruning and grafting would ultimately create something entirely new, something that would no longer be the Ottoman Empire at all. And so we come to the end of our long journey through the centuries, to that moment when even the most enduring of earthly powers must bow to the inexorable passage of time. The year was 1922, and the Ottoman Empire, which had once stretched its protective wings across 3 continents, was preparing for its final sunset. The Great War had ended 4 years earlier, leaving Europe scarred and exhausted. But for the Ottoman Empire, it had been something far more devastating than a mere war. It had been a final, fatal hemorrhage of strength that no amount of reform or determination could staunch. The empire that had once sent tremors of fear through the courts of Vienna and Moscow now found itself partitioned by foreign powers, its territories carved up like a feast among victors. In the quiet corridors of what remained of Ottoman power, the sound of boots on marble had been replaced by the whisper of documents being sorted, filed, and packed away. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, moved through his palace like a ghost haunting his own tomb, understanding that he was not merely the end of a dynasty, but the conclusion of a way of life that had endured for over 6 centuries. Picture that November morning in 1922, when the Sultanate was formally abolished. The mist rose from the Bosphorus, as it had for millennia. The seagulls called across the water, as they always had, and the sun cast the same golden light on the domes and minarets of Istanbul. But something fundamental had changed in the very air itself. The weight of empire, that invisible force that had pressed down upon the city for so long, had finally lifted. On November 17, 1922, the last Sultan departed Constantinople forever, boarding a British warship that would carry him into exile. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Mehmed VI stood on the deck, watching the city that had been the heart of his empire grow smaller and smaller until it was nothing but a gleaming line on the horizon. The Ottoman Empire officially ended in 1922, when the title of Ottoman Sultan was eliminated. But from the ashes of empire, like a phoenix rising from flames, came something new and unexpected. Mustafa Kemal, the general who had defended the Dardanelles and saved the empire's honor in its darkest hour, now led a revolution that would transform the very nature of Turkish society. He did not seek to restore the empire. He understood that empires, like seasons, must end, but to create something entirely different. On October 29, 1923, Turkey was declared a republic, and Mustafa Kemal became its first president, later taking the name Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks. This was not merely a change of government, but a transformation of identity itself. The Sultan's subjects became modern citizens. The age-old privileges and hierarchies gave way to concepts of equality and democracy. The Caliphate, that spiritual leadership of the Islamic world that the Ottoman sultans had claimed for centuries, was abolished in 1924. The last caliph, Abd al-Mehmed II, departed Istanbul carrying nothing but a suitcase and the weight of history. With his departure, an institution that had connected the Ottoman Empire to the very founding of Islam came to an end. But here, in the quiet of our evening together, we must pause to consider what truly ends and what endures. The Ottoman Empire, as a political entity, ceased to exist, yes, but the Ottoman legacy, that vast tapestry of culture, architecture, literature, and human experience continued to live in ways both visible and invisible. Walk through the streets of Istanbul today, and you will find yourself surrounded by the gentle persistence of Ottoman memory. The Suleimani Mosque still lifts its perfect dome toward heaven, its proportions as harmonious as they were when Mimar first conceived them. The Grand Bazaar still echoes with the voices of merchants, though now they sell to tourists, rather than to the caravans that once crossed Empire's dot in the former provinces of the empire, from the Balkans to the Middle East, from North Africa to the Caucasus. The Ottoman influence persists like a melody that continues to play long after the musicians have left the stage. The architectural styles, the administrative systems, the social customs, the very ways that different peoples learn to live together, all of these carried forward into the modern world. The Turkish language itself became a living museum of Ottoman experience. Though reformed and modernized, it still carries within its structure the echoes of Persian poetry, Arabic scholarship, and the dozens of languages that had flourished under Ottoman rule. Every time someone in modern Turkey speaks of justice, mercy, or beauty, they use words that carry the weight of centuries. In the kitchens of the former empire, the recipes perfected in Ottoman palace kitchens continued to nourish families. The techniques of carpet weaving, metalwork, and calligraphy passed from master to apprentice, carrying forward skills that had been honed in the workshops of Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire's legacy is deeply woven into the fabric of modern Turkey, from architectural wonders and culinary delights to cultural festivals and societal structures. Perhaps most remarkably, the Ottoman approach to diversity, that complex but generally successful method of allowing different peoples to maintain their identities while participating in a larger civilization, continued to influence how modern societies think about multiculturalism and tolerance. The millet system, which had allowed Christians, Jews, and Muslims to live side by side for centuries, offered lessons that would prove valuable in an increasingly interconnected world. The great libraries of the empire, scattered now across dozens of countries, preserved not just Ottoman texts, but the wisdom of all the civilizations that had contributed to Ottoman culture. Manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Greek, and Latin waited patiently on their shelves, ready to share their secrets with future generations of scholars. In the realm of music, Ottoman classical traditions continued to evolve and inspire. The haunting melodies of the ney, the complex rhythms of Ottoman court music, the spiritual songs of the Sufi orders, all of these continued to move human hearts long after the empire that had nurtured them had passed away. The very concept of Istanbul, that magical city where Europe meets Asia, where the call to prayer echoes over waters that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, became a symbol of the possibilities inherent in cultural synthesis. Modern visitors to the city often speak of feeling the presence of the past, as if the centuries of Ottoman life had somehow infused the stones themselves with memory. In the academic world, Ottoman studies flourished as scholars from around the globe worked to understand and preserve the empire's vast historical legacy. Universities established chairs in Ottoman history. Museums displayed Ottoman artifacts, and gradually, a more nuanced understanding of the empire's achievements and failures began to emerge. The Ottoman legal tradition, which had attempted to balance Islamic law with practical governance, continued to influence legal thinking in many successor states. The empire's administrative practices, refined over centuries of governing diverse populations, provided models for modern bureaucracies. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Ottoman Empire lies not in any specific institution or practice, but in the very idea that it represented the possibility that different peoples, languages, and faiths could coexist within a single political framework, each contributing their unique gifts to a common civilization. As we reach the end of our journey together, the crescent moon that had once adorned the Ottoman flag still shines in the night sky. unchanged by the rise and fall of earthly powers. It reminds us that some things are eternal, the human capacity for beauty, for justice, for the kind of grandeur that transcends political boundaries. The Ottoman Empire had been, in its way, a dream made manifest, the dream of a universal Islamic state that could encompass the diversity of human experience while maintaining a common purpose. Like all dreams, it was imperfect, sometimes contradictory, and ultimately temporary. But like the greatest dreams, it left behind something precious, the memory of what human beings can achieve when they dare to imagine themselves as part of something larger than their immediate circumstances. In the end, empires fall as surely as leaves fall from trees in autumn. But the seeds they scatter, the ideas, the arts, the ways of being human that they nurture, these can take root in new soil and grow into forms that their creators could never have imagined. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, carry with you the image of that crescent moon hanging serenely over the Bosphorus, casting its silver light on waters that connect not just continents, but past and future, dream and reality. The Ottoman Empire may have ended, but its story continues in every act of tolerance, every moment of beauty, every attempt to build something greater than the sum of its parts. The empire that began with a nomadic tribe and grew to span 3 continents had completed its arc through history. But like the light from distant stars, its influence would continue to reach us long after the source had passed from view, reminding us that the greatest human achievements are not the empires we build, but the dreams we leave behind for others to dream anew. And in that gentle truth, we find our rest.